The H1B Guy here, and today, the H1B Guy news for the week ending August 21st, 2020. But before we get started, I just wanted to thank everyone who's taken time to watch one of my videos over the last week. From discussing Joe Biden's immigration policies to unveiling our solution to solve the employment-based green card backlog to the live Stamp It Out Q&A and researching merit-based immigration systems yesterday. The support this week has just been overwhelming, and I just cannot thank you enough. And to everyone who continues to direct message me with your words of support and encouragement, thank you. If you haven't already, I'd like to ask you to please go ahead and subscribe to the H1B Guy channel here on YouTube. It helps me to continue to produce more content like this. Now, the news. On August 20th of 2020, there was an article written by Uttara Varma for the Times of India titled H1B Woes, Deceased Man's Family to be Deported from the U.S. Quote, Lakshmi Narayan Sundararam, who passed away after battling leukemia on Monday, leaves behind his wife Sudha and 14-year-old son who will now be deported from the U.S. The family gets 14 days to sell their assets and leave the U.S. This is because Narayanan was on an H-1B visa and his wife and child were dependents, said friend Rajni Nala. He continued to work even from his hospital bed so that he could maintain his status. On Wednesday was the last day that his wife Sudha could work per her restrictions of her H-4 EAD. You know, this is just another sad immigrant journey story of an H-1B visa holder and their family. The circumstances that surround this are just so unfortunate, but I think the story needs to be told. You know, here's someone who came to the U.S. with his son as the primary source of motivation to do so. Now, a 14-year-old boy who's lived in the US for the past 6 years has no other option but to return from where he came from. And for Sudha, his wife, who was working under an H-4 EAD based on Lakshmi's certified perm labor and approved I-140, now she's lost any work authorization that she possessed and her legal immigrant status based on her husband's passing. Mr. Narayanan was evidently in the green card backlog as he was advocating for the passing of S-386. You know, I'll tell you that this story, along with the story of Manpreet Singh's from last week, are just simply heartbreaking to me. And there are hundreds of others like this one out there. Let's hope that we can continue to bring attention to these issues here on the H1B Guy channel and on the H1BGuy.com. On August 19th of 2020, the U.S. Department of State issued a visa bulletin for September 2020. There really isn't a lot to discuss or dissect around the visa bulletin, but I at least wanted to bring it up. You know, for those of you who are keeping up with the Visa Bulletin every month, then you probably have already realized that the numbers for EB1 through EB3, which are the three categories that we primarily talk about here on this channel, did not move from the August 2020 bulletin. So you may be asking yourself, you know, how is that even possible? And I think we have to really look at there's several factors that influence the bulletin on each month, but in no particular order. I think the current backlog, the looming furloughs, COVID-19, and really just how USCIS stalls for the sake of stalling. Now, I know this is from the State Department, but you know, ultimately, USCIS is the ones who would be tasked with processing the visas. Really are the contributing factors, if you will, to the final action priority dates and the reason that they didn't budge over the last 30 days. So I'm going to make a not so bold prediction here, and I'm going to say and predict that the October 2020 Visa Bulletin will look exactly the same as September's. For those of you watching who are waiting on your final action date, I want to say that I sure hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm going to be. On August 19th of 2020, in an article written by Stuart Anderson for Forbes titled, quote, H1B visa guidance means Trump likely to lose in court. So we've covered Stuart Anderson a good bit. He's one of the handful of immigration writers that covers immigration news for Forbes. And as we've talked about, why is Forbes covering immigration? Well, they follow the money, right? And so Stuart Anderson interviews H. Ronald Klasko of Klasko Immigration Law Partners, LLP. And there's a couple key takeaways that I had. So I wanted to start with the first one, and that is, quote, this is from Mr. Klasko. None of this even addresses how difficult it will be to meet the language of the guidance memo. Most H-1Bs are not resuming ongoing employment in the U.S., must meet a very difficult standard. Their travel must be, quote, necessary to facilitate the immediate and continued economic recovery of the U.S. Think about it. How many H-1Bs are necessary to facilitate the immediate and continued economic recovery of the U.S.? One other note, if the applicant is performing or could perform the functions of the position remotely from outside the U.S., he apparently doesn't qualify, end quote. And he closes by saying this, quote, additional presidential proclamations of highly questionable legality attempting to implement further restrictions on high-skilled immigration, and that there will also be an effort to restrict high-skilled immigration through regulatory process. So there really is a lot to unpack from this interview. You know, Mr. Klasko has been an immigration attorney for over 30 years. And while this is the first time I've read him quoted, he makes a lot of valid points. Breaking down how difficult it's going to be for an H1 to prove that their role is necessary. Add that to the discretion of the consulate's processing officer, as we've been talking about here for about a week, and we have the perfect storm for the continuation of restricted travel and potential for significant denials in consular processing. I will say I've read a lot of discussions from a few groups that I'm a member of, and while there's been a lot of questions around transferring between the international organization's payroll and U.S. payroll, Mr. Klasko insinuates here that if the role can be performed outside of the U.S., then the applicant most likely doesn't qualify. To me, that's a very scary interpretation of the language within the memo, especially if you're someone who is outside of the US with a valid work visa and considering what are the best options for you to stay employed and earn wages. He closes by predicting that more presidential proclamations restricting high-skilled immigrants and the continuation of the travel ban via, quote, regulatory processes. And I think he's alluding to here is, again, the consulate processing officer's discretion, or at least their supervisor's discretion in how they want the PO to process and adjudicate the case. So I will say, if you are an H-1B, living and working here in the U.S., I understand that you already have a significant amount of travel anxiety. It just goes with the territory. So let me be very clear and hear me on this. I'm sure a lot of you already are aware of this and already thinking this, but if you can avoid traveling outside of the U.S., I would do so at least until the beginning of 2020. And that's even if you have your stamping. I know that sounds crazy and probably not what you want to hear considering it's August, but I would not travel outside of the US if I'm here on a work visa, even if I have valid stamping. And then the final article for today, which was written on August 19th, 2020, written by Rebecca Morin, titled, Like Putting Salt on the Wound, Immigration Activists Criticize Obama's Role in DNC Immigration video. Quote, immigration is our origin story, Obama said in the video's voiceover. After all, unless your family is Native American, all of our families come from someplace else. Biden in February conceded that the Obama administration, quote, took far too long to get it right with immigration, and it was a big mistake. Some viewers also criticized Tuesday's segment as using immigrant pain while not addressing the Obama administration's record. And we've seen this discussed a lot, the promises that presidential candidate nominees make around immigration and then the lack of follow through historically, over the last 30 years. And, as we discussed on the H1B Guy live on Wednesday night, immigration is at the foundation of our great country unless you are Native American. All of our heritage can be traced back to other regions of the world. It's just a fact. So, really interesting quotes though at the very end from former Vice President Joe Biden saying that President Obama took too long to get it right and it was a big mistake. I'd be willing to go as far as to say he didn't even get it right, and that would not be even considered a stretch. It's also interesting to see that the intent to appeal to a wider pro immigration audience may have potentially backfired because they just didn't get the messaging right. If I'm being honest, I was wrong. I was really wrong, actually. I really believed last week after the announcement of Kamala Harris that the Democrats would have used the Democratic National Convention to address their pro immigration agenda and really appeal to the moderate Indian American voters, as we talked about, over 1 million Indian American voters. I think they really missed the mark on an opportunity to get their message out there. Instead, they only briefly covered the topic with Obama's voiceover and VP nominee Kamala Harris really just kind of gazing right past her mother and father's immigrant journeys. So, what that tells me is that most likely the data must have advised them to stay away from going too much deeper into the immigration debate, which I think may be a really terrible miscalculation on their part. As we stand today, we're 74 days away from the presidential election. Did the Biden campaign miss an opportunity to appeal to the moderate swing voters? As I've said, I believe they did, but I think only time will tell. It's going to be very interesting going into next week, Republican National Convention, to see how the Republicans address immigration, or even if they do. I'll make another guess of prediction here as well. Probably not too far out of the norm, but I'm going to say that we're going to hear more about strengthening our borders and protecting American workers' wages and jobs. Will I be right? Well, they'll answer that for me next week, won't they? As we all know, USCIS furloughs are still looming. We're going to be keeping a very eye on the pulse of this story next week. And that is the news for August 21st, 2020. For the full post, please check out the H1BGuy.com. I want to say thanks again to everyone who's made it all the way to the end. I just really appreciate the support. I'm really excited about what we have planned next week. We're going to cover a journey of a skilled immigrant who left the U.S. for Australia. We're going to have another round of the H1B Guy Unfiltered. We're also working on an article that dissects S3770, and we'll also cover the hearing that's scheduled for August 27th, and of course, another round of the H1B Guy news. The H1B Guy, your global source for all things H1B.